great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's panel discussion and introduce our special guests, Amorales, Demeester and Francesco Pellizzi. Prompted by the opening of a new exhibition at the Taros exhibition space at the Löwenbräu Areal tomorrow evening, our discussion is another joint venture between Taros Latin America and the Institute of Contemporary Arts and Media, following on from presentations and discussions with the artists Barbara Kruger, Alfredo Schaar and Guillermo Cuitga. I would like to express my thanks to Ruth Schmidheiny and Hans-Michael Herzog, head of Taros Latin America, for working with us to make this evening possible. I'm sure you are all familiar with Taros exhibitions, so I don't need to go into any more detail now. There's another important partner involved in this evening's event. ICFAR, the International Centre for Fine Art Research at the University of the Arts London, founded in April 2006. ICFAR is a research institute run by 4 art and design colleges in London. ICFAR maintains international partnerships with museums and schools of art, including CARARTS Los Angeles, the UDK in Berlin, and the HGK in Zurich. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome the Institute's members, Caroline Woodley and Chris Rouse, here today. This evening's event marks the start of a series of artists' panel discussions that these institutes are organizing in partnership. They will be held in London, Berlin and Zurich, and each will be followed by a small publication. I'd now like to briefly introduce the people on the podium this evening. You will doubtlessly be familiar with Carlos Amorales, the artist whose work we will be discussing this evening, from exhibitions at the Migros Museum and the Serge Ziegler Gallery here in Zurich. He's one of the most interesting members of the younger generation of Mexican artists. Born in Mexico and have been living in Amsterdam for many years, he now lives and works in Mexico City again. He has already had his own exhibitions and shown projects in museums such as Boijmans van Beuningen Museum in Rotterdam, the MoMA in San Francisco, the Tate Modern, and MUCA in Mexico City. In this country, he's best known for his wrestling performances, such as Amorales versus Amorales at the Migros Museum in 1999. And Demeester is closely familiar with the work of Carlos Amorales. She was recently appointed director of the Appel Center of Contemporary Art in Amsterdam. For a number of years previously, she had headed W139, a production and presentation platform for contemporary art in Amsterdam. In 2000 and 2001, she worked as assistant curator to Jan Hout at the Stedelijk Museum for Aktuelle Kunst, SMAK, in Gent. 2004, at the Music Total Free exhibition, the Appel presented Nuevos Ricos, the label with Carlos Amorales is associated. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about this later this evening. Professor Francesco Pellizzi is editor and co-founder of the journal Res, Anthropology and Aesthetics. He wrote his dissertation under the direction of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and since '74 he teaches Middle American ethnology and at the Peabody Museum and Art Museums at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For the last 2 years, he has also held the chair of the university seminar on the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas at Columbia University in New York. As an anthropologist, he is intimately familiar with South American culture, and in particular that of Mexico, where he was involved in a number of projects since the late 60s. But his work also extends to contemporary art. He's a trustee of the Menil Collection in Houston and has written essays on major artists of our time, including for the art magazine Parquet. He's currently working at the Max Planck Institute in Florence. This evening will start with Carlos Amorales showing us some images and as an introduction to his work. Then he and Demeester and Francesco Pellizzi will discuss the different aspects and context of this output. Afterwards, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, and I warmly invite you to do so. Many thanks. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I present Carlos Amorales. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Hello, everybody. First of all, I want to thank you and also thank Francesco and Arte to be here. And what I will start with is just to give a small, well, not small, but a short panorama of like the work I've been doing, let's say, from 2003, which is when I stopped the wrestling project till now. Maybe some of you are more familiar with the wrestling or have seen it, but what I want more to concentrate is in the later work, which is more what is going to be included in the show tomorrow. So, what you're seeing here is basically an installation shot, including my archive, which is a drawing archive, which I've been developing in the last years, maybe slowly since '99 to now, still an archive that is in progress. And it's basically all the forms I use for creating mainly animations and installations, and also paintings and other kind of works. The archive in itself is a graphical, let's say it's a digital archive, so it's mostly made with digital drawings, what is called vectors. So let's say the real archive, the other was more like just kind of a visual representation of it, exists in the computer. For instance, there you can see like a letter type, or it has animals, it has all different categories which I've been kind of creating slowly. What I find special of this archive is that somehow it's as it's a vector drawing, it can be expressed in different ways. It can be like the shape of the drawings can be changed. I can also make decisions about form, size, how to express it. So it's basically more than everything kind of almost like a mathematical equation. So it's almost like it doesn't exist. It's just a series of commands. What I've been doing in the last years is to try to explore kind of in meaning and also in technique how to use this type of drawing, which I think is in fluxus. So I've been developing these are stills, for instance, from animations. This is the first animation. It's a very simple animation. It's an installation shot of how I present it. This is another idea of animation, which is more, it's a mobile, so it's more an installation. So basically, when you walk into the space, the figures start to move. So what's an idea to think about animation too? And this is another one. And also, I made like slide projections. I try different ways to explore doing compositions with this archive. These, for instance, are paintings, which I also make. Sorry. One thing with the archive is that I also, as it became a tool more than a medium in itself, I started to think how to use it, or let's say not to use it only me particularly to create my own work, but to start to create collaborations with other people where I could let them transform the archive and give meaning to the archive themselves. So for instance, this piece, which is going to be shown tomorrow, I commissioned a graphic designer and an animation artist to play with my archive and create a film. and let's say without my own input, you know, I just commission it, so I just let it free for them to work with it. And I also asked a musician who played the piano for the films, for silent films, to also try to create a work, a sound piece from that. This relates more to the Rorschach, for instance, so because then came more ideas about how to interpret the archive, how to, you know, not how to only express it technically, but how, what can it mean, how can other people work with it. So for instance, this is another work where I created some kind of tarot-like cards, so it's kind of adivinatory cards. So what I did was to ask all different tarot readers to try to give meaning to these drawings. Which I filmed. And this is an installation where you see where you can see the cards. It's almost like a tarot reading room. This again is an installation with models. Just different works I've been doing with the archive, just trying to expand it. So, also animations. So I think with this you can have a little bit of a visual idea, and I would like maybe to find out.
Thank you. But first of all, I'd like to very much thank Carlos Amorales, the Hochschule für Gestaltung und Kunst, the Institute for Kunst and Media, and the Daros Foundation for making this possible and inviting me to come all the way from Florence, where I am. And all the more because I am not an expert on the work of Carlos Amorales. I have written on several Mexican artists, it's true, and in recent years, but I'm not really an expert on his particular work, which I came to encounter only very, very recently. But I do relate to it. And so I decided that the best approach for me in commenting was to free associate from the images that were sent to me of his recent work and see what came to me from where I was at that particular moment when I actually got to see and relate to these images, rather than actually go into the very articulate and complex statements that Amorales himself has provided about his work in several interviews, which I encourage you all to read, which will be much more informative than anything that I, and even Anne Demeester, despite her great professionalism and knowledge, can provide to you. The context of my reaction, of my the direct and associative reaction, was being at the Max Planck in Florence and dealing with various issues of art historical and anthropological, but mostly art historical, being there. And in particular, I was involved in a seminar at the Uffizi, organized with the Kunsthistorische, which had to do with this extraordinary exhibition of engravings and drawings, which is currently there, of the Medici collections of Dürer's prints. And the Medici collection of Dürer's prints is the most complete collection perhaps in the world, or one of the most complete, perhaps in Vienna they had a similar one, but of all his prints. And Marzia Fayetti was the head of drawings and prints at Uffizi, gave us a seminar which we all participated and discussed, where she was actually bringing Dürer in confrontation with Mantegna. Dürer was very interested in Mantegna, and of course, because of the graphic work of Mantegna and the relationship to his own graphism. And in particular, what Fayetti was interested in was the lines, the shading and lines in the work of Mantegna and Dürer. And she discovered, I think she is the one who has actually discovered this, pointed it out at least first, that they are quite different, despite the fact that Dürer was looking at Mantegna and being, in a way, his disciple. And they are different in a way, in the following way. Mantegna's is a shading that goes always in one direction. It's always directional, and it's aimed at creating this sort of bas-relief effect, which is and Dürer, on the contrary, is a reticular kind of shading, where lines constantly move, go in all directions, and actually somehow marry the image and become so mimetic and illusionistic. It's a crucial shift. You may have noticed, and you will notice more in the show, that Amorales' lines are curious in this sense. The modernist line. The modernist movement, of course, is in a way closer to Mantegna, looks back to the sort of late medieval reductionism more than to the illusionistic early Renaissance reductionism of Dürer, right? We go more for that. It's enough to think of the Chirico, you know, and how. But in Amorales' case, I find that lines do go in all directions without being actually illusionistic. So there is a reduction, there is modernist reductionism in a way, there is a refusal of any illusionism, and yet there is something that is also, I think, belongs to the great tradition of, you know, which we can sort of bring back to Dürer. So the modernist penchant for abstraction, analysis, reduction has brought us to feel almost closer to Mantegna, as I said. But in Dürer, however, well, one thing I wanted to say comment about this aspect, which has to do, in my view, also about the relationship between abstraction and figuration. And this is something that struck me here even more when I arrived here than when I was thinking about it in Florence, in looking at the dark mirror and the images. And there is this tension constantly between the two. And of course, it's also in your interview. And this is a question. It's something for our discussion. It's not something I'm going to go into, but it's something which I think is important. And the way I would like to put it is that it might be interesting to talk about how abstraction and figuration work, abstraction versus figuration on intention, the way they are, work for Amorales in relationship to his great interest in narrative, in narration. You know, what is this narration that is constantly, you know, what is abstract narration? In some way, you know, and that's one point that. But of course, in thinking of Dürer, since starting from there, one image in particular, and here we go more towards the content of the images and the imagery. One image that we thought about a lot in this seminar is a famous one, you know, that you all know by heart. You know, it's Melancholia. You know, the image of Melancholia. As an allegorical depiction of hypochondria, replete with alchemical, proto-scientific, and magical reference. It could be taken as the inaugural banner of the modern age. A young American scholar has recently discovered that a version of the central figure already appeared in many key paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. For instance, the Garden of Delight, the Epiphany, the Last Judgment. I have the images here, I can show you all later. A new quantified and directional conception of time accompanies the westward and eastward expression of the West. This is the setting of the new humanism of Erasmus and Pico della Mirandola, but is also a trap of sorts, a web with no teleological aim and metaphysical direction. In a bleak vision of Dürer's Melancholia, it is represented by the exquisite spider's web. I can't show it to you because it's tiny. It's tiny, but it's crucial. It's in the direction in which the figure of Melancholia is actually looking. In the lower left corner, with the insect prey caught in it. Looking at this web, surrounded by the great array of tools, measuring devices, geometrical form, etc., under the pensive gaze of the image of melancholy, and knowing that I could be coming here to Zurich, I could not help but think of Carlos Amorales and his own webs, in particular the one in his piece for Imaginary Friend of 2003, which you will see. I'm not saying that Carlos Amorales is affected by melancholia. I'm calling attention to the fact that nowadays, in our age of widespread depression and relative drugs to assuage it, the fine and deep web of melancholia which inaugurated the modern age may still have some relevance, not least in the formation and interpretation of aesthetic praxis. Even those pools of atrabilis, black bile, which were associated with the representation of the posture of melancholia, for instance in Bosch, reappear prominently in the post-human and transhuman geographies of Amorales, as for instance in Motion World Maps 1, but also in the installation of flat aluminum sculptures at the center of his Broken Animal serigraphs, 2006. Or even, it seems to me, the Vinyl's installation of his Red Rorschach of 2006, where the dark bile of the Broken Animal and the Motion World Maps, sardonic neo-apocalyptic visions of a future of biological as well as tectonic geological recombinations, turns into blood-red spills of the experience taken as positive in Amorales, Why Fear the Future? The experience taken as positive appears in your piece. I have mentioned alchemy in relation to Dürer's Melancholia. Amorales' title, Dark Mirror, can be related to the dictum Through a Glass Darkly, where the glass of the alembic is also the mirror of the soul. Distillation and sublimation can be related, not only metaphorically, to the process by which experimental progress is transmuted into an experiential one. Of inner realization, the eyes of the figures of melancholy look inwards. Such experience, in both art and alchemy, unlike in science, cannot be predicted, however. And this is very important in Amorales. The unpredictability of the process, which I think is dear to him, if I understand well. I see in this analogy at least one of the possible senses of Amorales' conception and pursuit of a performative aesthetics. I do not only mean that Amorales' art is not, at least not principally, about generating objects. He acts as if the creative process is in fact one of constant rearrangement and recontextualization of his own archive. I mean performance in the sense, in a way, again in a way alchemical, of a sustained polemical engagement. Other important young artists today, even Mexican, for instance Artigas, have a somewhat similar orientation. But in Amorales, the polemos is first of all towards the self, towards the mask of the self, and towards the self as mask. Amorales versus Amorales. The mysterious mirror of identity and alterity. We can discuss all of this later. It's an important point. This polemical aspect, which is also that of the warrior facing the ghost of his own fear, may relate Amorales' Dark Mirror to a Mexican theme of ancient mythological and cosmological, to an ancient mythological and cosmological one. Smoking mirror is one of the name attributes of Tezcatlipoca, the warrior god of the Aztecs. Tezcatlipoca walks behind the shield of darkness, and dark is his face or his mask. It is the eclipse of light through which one must proceed in outer and inner battle, before blood turns into light, red into gold, shadow into sunlight. It is also the specular nature of war, Heraclitus Polemos, ubiquitous social war, or what the great Mexican thinker and writer of popular culture today, Carlos Monsiváis, has called our post-apocalypsis. It is an age, as Nietzsche said, in which it is necessary to disperse the universe, to lose respect for the whole. In any event, we need the dark mirror of Amorales, just as some of his distant ancestors needed the smoking or smoked one of Tezcatlipoca, because, as it is said in La Rochefoucauld's 26 Maxime, neither the sun nor death can be looked upon with a steady eye. Now, 3 more points I would like to touch upon before I turn over to Anne. One is about Amorales' atopia, what I call Amorales' atopia. The second is the historical position of his mirror, just a few things about that. And the third is all-important element of the archive. Almost 3 years ago in Moscow, we had a conference about hierotopia, the traditional configuration of sacred that is separate places. I argued that for most of our human history, there have mainly been funerary places, and that the corpse can even be considered our first artifact, together with the body, of course. This is also what Carl Schmitt has called the nomos of the earth, the earthy kingdom, and Amorales started actually from that notion of the earth, of the earthy kingdom, and in the beginning of his work, I believe. He saw modernity in the late Middle Ages, I'm talking of Carl Schmitt, inaugurating the nomos of the sea, the universe of seafaring empires, the universe of water, and our modernist age as that of the rule from or of the air. I see this airy quality omnipresent in the fluidity of Amorales' non-places, atopias, not just in his bird and airplane imagery, but also in the way all the apparitions he conjures up, from his useless wonder paintings to his black drawings, are immersed in and as if perpetually moved by relentless air currents. These are flows in which the lines visualize fields of energy within which bodily presences are delineated as negative interspersions, non-places again, or new versions of what Marcel Duchamp called delays, as when he said that his bride struck bare was a delay in glass. The medium, and he just referred to the medium, the instrument and medium, the medium is diaphanous but not fully transparent in any sense. And what is left are traces of movement, presences and absences, with no univocal determination as to which may be which. And yet these delays in Amorales appear fully swept into the flow, as if precipitating towards an unfathomable evolutionary destiny and destination. Amorales, with his sophisticated conceptuality, is fully in our modernist Western tradition, but way at the front edge of it, so that there is no question regarding his work of centrality versus marginality, regional versus global, etc. So much so that I am tempted to apply to him, in this respect, the following words by the Lebanese critic Jalal Tufik, whom you might know. What can resist, and this is relevant because it has to do with this question of regionality versus globality. I'm quoting, what can resist and resist the expansion of globalization is not the local of every country, but the universal of artistic works, which present each a universe that is not part of the expanding universe in which humans materially live, but borders it. And this border, again a non-place, is what I call the universe of Amorales' atopia. Finally, if I have a minute more, a word about Carlos Amorales' extraordinary personal and collective archive. Not in particular about its specific iconography, but, so to speak, about some of its possible theoretical underpinnings of the archaeology of his imagination, as it were. I'm referring, as you must have guessed, to Michel Foucault's archaeology of knowledge. An archive, in Foucault's words, is, I quote, an a priori of positives, which is not only a system of temporal dispersion, it is itself a transformable group, these are words of Foucault, and a system of statements. so that it is, I quote, first the law of what can be said, the system that governs the appearance of statements as unique events. And this is important, unique events. It seems clear how relevant Foucault's formulation is to an enterprise such as Amorales, and not only in relation to issues of hybrid media and identities, as I have already tried to indicate, but because, in Foucault's own words, the never completed, never wholly achieved uncovering of the archive forms the general horizon to which the mapping of the enunciative field belongs. Or in other words, the making and unmaking of our post-apocalyptic inventory, which I think is what Amorales is doing. Now, the unmaking of the archive refers to its shadow side, which Amorales has invoked. And so, and you will not like me for this, but I cannot resist evoking, in this context of this conversation, a formulation that can be found in Derrida's vertiginous account of Freud's vision of the death drive. So it's the 6th chapter of Civilization and its Discontent. This is referred to as the hypopneuma, the underlying and even external mneme, mnemomechanical supplement or representative in triangulation, and I quote, with this dual opposition of principles of archive, the reality principle and the pleasure principle. The originality of Derrida, even in relation to Foucault, is that on the one hand he sees the death drive, which is not a principle, as eminently anarchivic, or as he also says, archiviolytic, and thus, like sacrifice, a pure loss expenditure, and as uneconomic, as an invincible necessity, an anche. But on the other hand, he rediscovers, with Freud, that this mute, stumm, anarchic drive, which destroys the archive, bequeaths no monument of its own. There is no monument at the end of this process. As inheritance, I quote again, it leaves only its erotic simulacrum, its pseudonym in painting, its sexual idols, its marks of seduction, lovely impressions of what is obscurely called the beauty of the beautiful, as memories of death. One could hardly imagine a formulation more inherently Mexican than that. But Derrida argues further, and I shall end with this, that the archive, I'm quoting, will never be either memory or anamnesis, a spontaneous, alive, and internal experience, and that there is no archive without a place of consignation, without a technique of repetition, and without a certain exteriority. No archive without outside. I find this outside to relate to the environment of what I have called the airiness of Amorales' Utopias, just as Derrida's affirmation, in a way against Foucault, that the archive always worked and a priori against itself, is what I have called its dark mirror side, the piece at the heart of its polemos. It is dark because, in the words of Giorgio Agamben, the archive is a dark margin encircling and limiting every concrete act of speech, as in Amorales' narratives. But perhaps Amorales, through toy-like play, is finding a way of eliminating repetition from the archive to create a non-repetitive archive, which is an oxymoron. This may lead to his pirate paradise. And if this is so, indeed, why fear the future? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you might have noticed, we do everything in reverse tonight, in the sense that you have not seen the show yet, so it becomes a kind of invisible presence, a kind of ghost. There's a conversation, and Francesco starts with the interpretation. a very, I think, elaborate and very well thought through interpretation of the work as a whole. So we have to take a few steps backwards to actually to maybe the factual, in the sense that you have interpreted through a sort of variety of experiences and a multiplicity of knowledges. And I think that already enriches the experience that you will have in seeing the show, hopefully, and possibly tomorrow. I think in that sense I should be your counterpart, and I see my role tonight as more sort of the interrogator and maybe the person who sort of provides a number of more factual things, in the sense that as you might see the show tomorrow, the core of it or the heart of it is the liquid archive. That's the thing that sort of generates the whole exhibition. And the liquid archive, I think you have to correct me if I'm wrong, Carlos, currently, because it's sort of ever expanding, or that's how it seems to be right now, a sort of possibly infinite structure. It consists of 2,300 images, and I'm continuously doubting, and I think maybe we might come back to that later on as well, whether I should call them images, forms, figures, emblems, symbols. I mean, their status is quite unclear, and I think that also relates to what Francesco has been saying, that we should mention about the abstract narration, or using abstraction in order to generate narratives. But as you will see, that so the liquid archive consists of these 1,300 digital things, let's call them. They're almost imaginary ideas that have been, through a computer process, turned into an image or a form or an emblem. And you will see that they are, you could maybe, for yourself, discover different categories in that. You will see a large number of animals, a large number of sort of, let's call them vegetal or botanical motifs. You will see imaginary creatures that are mostly hybrids. You will see sort of morbid abstract forms that are fragmented all the time. And all those images form a kind of visual vocabulary that is both the artist, but it also belongs to the people that he gives the permission to work with them. So they're I see them as a kind of language, and that's maybe where I wanted to start, because in the show you will see that the liquid archive has different avatars. I call them avatars, it's a bit of a fashionable word now, but I think it's just a sort of, it's an incarnation of the liquid archive. And you already went through a number of them in the slideshow, but there's more. In the exhibition there's a series of collages, there's a series of paintings, there is the alphabetical categorization. It's a sort of paper representation of the archive in the form of objects. They are drawings, but I think they're also objects. And there's two films, one that you have in a way directed, and one that where you really delegated the creative responsibility that sort of came into existence without your interference. And I think that the liquid archive has a sort of has an enormous potential to generate even more, may I use the word avatar? To generate a sort of infinite number of incarnations. So it might be that in 10 years you will see the work of Carlos Amorales and we'll still be dealing with the liquid archive. But maybe my first question would relate to the sort of, it's a sort of double question, and maybe the first part we can ignore and the second part you can reply to. Because as my background is I am not an art historian. I mean, I've been working in the visual arts for a number of years, but I studied literature and linguistics. And immediately, the thing that struck me the most is that you call it an archive. You don't call it a database, you don't call it a repertoire, you don't call it a collection, you don't call it a constellation of images, but you call it an archive. So there must be, that's maybe a point that we can come back to also, that how do you call these things? Are they images, are they forms, are they emblems, are they symbols? But another part is more maybe about the whole, because when I entered the show, it feels a bit like it's a sort of semiotic bomb, because there's so much potential in it that there's so much possible ways of reading this that you're completely thrown back onto your own framework. I think we have heard Francesco's interpretation. It comes very much also from his own cultural background and knowledge, and I felt like every single image, it's like an empty sign, because if I see the wolf, you immediately think, of course, the fairy tale, Little Red Riding Hood. You think of threat, danger, but you also think of Romulus and Remus, of the wolf as a kind of caring mother figure. And everything depends on actually your own background as a viewer, whatever you see in it. I'm a bit long-winded, but the point I wanted to come to is that I really see that the thing that you've created, the liquid archive, it's a kind of I would call it persolect, or what we call it in linguistics idiolect, which is a personal dialect. It's a kind of contradiction, because any kind of dialect, any kind of language needs a shared community of people who know that language in order to function as a language. But the idiolect is a language created and used only by one person. And so I found it a very interesting tension, that on the one hand it's your own personal vocabulary that is very cryptic and coded. We don't know what you mean with certain images. And on the other hand, you give it as a sort of, almost as a kind of visual Esperanto to other people, to use it as a tool to express their own message. So am I correct in seeing it as a sort of language, or?
It touches a lot, I think, language. And it has indeed a very personal part, or let's say I can also look at it and almost see it as a diary, or I can recognize the specific moments of my life. Because in a way I also develop it in a very intuitive way. Something also that happened with it is that it's not like one day I decided to form it and then I just work on it like for years until it's there. I actually became aware of it after 3 years of doing it. So, but I was not even aware that this thing existed. And what happened is just that I did all kind of different drawings. And then I thought it would be handy to kind of isolate the elements and start ordering them. And it's only until then that I became aware of it. And maybe it was just only 100 images by then. And then I started to really work on it. So I think it has something as a lot of a private idiom. But in another way, I've been reading a lot about fantasy and kind of horror stories. So there are a lot of common cliches or common ground. So like people tend to you know, they become universal. Like the wolf for everybody is kind of, or mostly for everybody, is kind of a scary thing. So that's also when it can also appeal to other people's comprehension. So for instance, when you see a pregnant woman in it, you don't have to think of my wife, but you think in a more general pregnant woman. Or you can also think of an image that contains another image, for instance. Something I found interesting was when I interviewed all these tarot readers, was to see how some of these symbols, how completely different they could be interpreted. As for instance, the spider web, where for a lot of them was really a scary thing, as something very repulsive. One of them saw it as a home, as a casa, how do you say that? Which is the home of the spider. You know, it gives it a completely other meaning. And to me, this is really what I find very interesting. I also think it's very different how a graphic designer will, for instance, relate to the archive, as for instance in this book, or in the or in what Daros did now for the children, in the educational program, which is also a sort of interpretation of it. As let's say, if I give it to another professional artist to work with. So in that sense is where I feel is very open, and I feel it also transcends my own, let's say, my own personality as an artist. That's also why I don't want it to call it exactly just as my, it's not an autobiography. And I think a lot of the strategies that I've been taking is basically to erase myself from it. So almost the archive can exist by itself, or at least see possibilities.
Yeah. Maybe going back to Francesco, because at a certain point also in reading the book that is being passed around is an interpretation of the two Dutch designers, Meeuwis and Van Beursen, of actually the archive. And what they did is they really cut it up. They destroyed almost all the motives. They made it completely abstract. And in a sense also, I think it was Linda who says in the interview, the designer's interview that Carlos did, where she says, well, we actually have no message to tell. So then we just work with it as a sort of visuals, as graphics. And I wanted to relate that maybe back to, or bring that back to Francesco, like this.
If you want, I could comment on this. on what you just said.
Yes,
If you don't mind
absolutely
views,
not.
but just very briefly. I think it's fascinating, this question of the archive, of a personal archive, because we always think of archives as this thing that's there. Right? The archive is that's what Foucault is talking about, and that's what Derrida is talking about. They're talking about these cultural issues of our relating to the bodies of knowledge and bodies of images and bodies, and all this question, also this question of death, how they do represent death in this sense, and how they, in a way, there is a limit to what they can possibly be. But you're talking of that's why I was saying you are actually undoing the archive, and that's why I had to put it. You are destroying it because you're making it so personal. You're making something that is constantly making itself. So it's this autobiography, as you said. But it's an autobiography that it's constantly sort of going on and moving and changing itself. So it's actually undoing itself always.
I think it's something maybe inherent to working with computers.
Also.
Because in computers, let's say you can copy and paste, you can go back. Let's say it's much more flexible the way you can use an archive, because you can just easily reproduce it, and it's almost a very graphical thing. It's like working with the old cliches, to print. Just that you could imagine these cliches to be flexible instead of metallic and made of wood. So it's kind of the same thing.
And how important is actually, let's say, technology in the formal part of your work, because you use black and whites, which make them even more seem like empty forms. You sometimes use primary colors, but how important is actually the whole technological process in the result that you end up with, or also on a conceptual level? If you would have hand drawn these forms, would it be the same? Or
yeah, the difference is if I would have drawn them, they will be fixed in time. Maybe I could erase them, or I could put water on them. But basically, the drawing as a text, as a handwritten text, is imprinted. And in this way, the computer is not imprinted. It's never permanent. You can save it, but at the same time also you can lose it.
So it's as if you had brought pentimento to be a system, actually. So your whole system is pentimento, because it's constantly undoing what you do.
Yes, it's like the archive is represented black because it should be represented one way, or it could be red, but it could also be transparent and just be, when I select it, let's say the computer exists. So it's basically this potentiality which made it closer to a mental process.
Yeah.
That I don't know if a drawing itself is so mental, and it's what I found interesting in that sense. I mean, I don't think technologically they are quite simple technologically. It's not that,
but in a sense, because it's almost like it seems almost like an imaginary museum, not in the sense of Malraux, but more it's a computer file, but it's also an idea that sort of constantly multiplies, and the computer actually allows you to let it be more an idea than really palpable objects all the time.
The palpability becomes expression. So the palpability is let's say you decide some variables. So you can say, okay, I want it to be red, I want it to be cotton wood, I want it to be very big or very, very small, I want to be reproduced infinite, or I want it to be just one piece. And this is a second process. And also it's then where I start to combine the elements of the archive. And when I combine the elements is when images become. So it's when let's say a painting starts to exist. But let's say in itself they are solitary images. I don't know how to explain. They are not compositions.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the computer as being important to this process, but you don't, as I understand it, you don't let the computer, though, by itself generate its own narrative. I mean, it's always a narrative that somehow you inject into the computer. You don't go the step of actually letting the computer programming itself develop this, right? Or no, I don't know.
No,
Not yet.
Not yet, right?
Maybe never.
Maybe that.
Like
ask you something?
No, I'm actually more interested, even if it's computer, I work with computer, I'm very interested in non-computer things. So, except the animations, which are really digital, like the rest of the work, I even tend not to make digitally.
That maybe brings us to sort of maybe this notion of authorship and collective creativity, because something we discussed also yesterday, the liquid archive, some people tend to think that it's open source, so it's copyleft, anybody can use it, but that's not true. You always delegate it to certain people, so it's always a kind of collaboration. And is it then a Carlos Amorales thing, or is it maybe some van Deursen, or where does it stop and where does it begin? And maybe also, how do you select people that you work with?
Yeah, this conversation was very much because the press people were very excited about the possibility to put this in internet, let everybody, which I think is a bit like overestimating internet, because it's also not like if you put it in internet that everybody in the world will use it, you know? It's still very close. I also think that to do that is maybe a very obvious thing to do, and also I don't think it's so exciting, I think. I'm more interested in very specific process that, for instance, happened with the graphics of the record label, where we actually put some graphics, some record covers, let's say, that related to the archive on the web, and then people start to use them to make pirate records. So, for instance, there was like a very interesting way, because it also became physical. Because what to me is very interesting in this is that also the archive becomes physical at a certain point, or the images from the archive. So, for instance, it was very surprising to go to the metro station and see a little shop for pirate records and suddenly see one of my birds, which is a very simple image. But of course they also manipulate it because they print it and misprint it, and maybe they find it too boring, so they change the black into red, and so they also kind of reprocess it. For instance, what I did in this particular case was to then
you were talking
collect,
about your label,
well,
or
yes, but which was a conduit for the archive. So was to collect all these pirate images that were in the streets, and then we got signed by MI, so we became official record label. And
maybe we should briefly explain to people what Nuevos Ricos is. Maybe you don't know.
Nuevos Ricos is a record label which I started with a friend some years ago. So both works. And basically, yeah, it's a bit like well, we publish records and we promote brands. So like a lot of, and I also use a lot of my graphics in it. Let me show you. Like here in the floor, you could see. I mean, maybe it's not so clear, but these are CDs, which is a bird, like a lot of bird. And this image we put into our website. And it's the image that people start to roll, to steal, and to manipulate. So for instance, these are record covers. And let's say these record covers, they become accessible for people, because people just steal them. Here. So for instance, these are pirate interpretations of the same. And sometimes they also invent like new forms. So it doesn't have to exactly be. What I do then is like I take, for instance, this was invented by them. So this is the design of somebody.
Yeah, and you don't know who, so it's a sort of anonymous author.
But then what I have to do is to take that design and bring it into my archive. So then becomes again a kind of cycle. But for instance, this at the beginning was just a white, a black dog on a white background. And what they did was to change it to red. So basically then what we did was to compile it into a new official album published by EMI, and then we bring it into the shops, and it was kind of distributed nationwide.
So you're
again you
confusing
start,
all the channels of distribution.
yes, and you're also subverting things, because of course it's a crime to make a pirate record, but it's not a crime to make a pirate image, at least not in that industry. But then to bring the pirate image into the shop,
official system.
I think becomes an interesting game that way. I mean, I'm sure the guys who did this were super happy.
Or maybe very angry that you appropriated their appropriation of your symbol.
Well, that's a little revenge. And it mostly happened with most of the... And what happened also to us, which was very beautiful, is that we organized a franchise or a kind of between shop and installation, but also an installation that people could just buy and treat it as a franchise, so people could just go on. And then a group of artists from Colombia saw it in the internet, and they organized their own franchise. So like, for instance, they completely changed over. They also, let's say, fuck around with my images. And then again, these images start to fit the archive.
Back into the archive.
So for me, it's this kind of very specific things which I find can be very exciting. Because maybe in this case touches, the archive almost becomes a social happening, for instance. So yeah.
So it's a sort of constant process of metamorphosis and becoming. That's maybe why I said that in the beginning, or it was more of a question, is it an infinite structure? I mean, do you see it like expanding all the time, or will there be things? Yesterday we also made a reference to a project by Philippe Moreno and Anne Lee, where two French artists bought an existing manga character, Anne Lee, gave it to other artists to work with, but in the end, and it might be that I'm now sort of surfing too much on the urban legend, is that in the end they also closed the system because Anne Lee now again has the copyright on herself. The sort of cartoon character that owns her own copyright, so it means that she's dead because she can no longer be used. Do you see a moment of closure for the archive, or?
It can be. I mean, I don't want to work with it forever. But maybe I see it can transform completely to something else, and maybe it goes into a different level, and then it can continue existing. What I don't want is to continuously think in another new strategy and kind of try to do it. I think what I like of these happenings is that they even were faster than I didn't even thought about it. So I just had to be very fast to understand them, that they were happening, so I could play with them. Let's say, when MI say, okay, now you can make a compilation, so this particular album official with us, like we are licensing it, I could have also thought, okay, I'm going to make a really beautiful cover for it, or invite another artist in it. But then I understood that these other garbage images were coming. So this is what I think is interesting, where when the archive starts to become
its own life.
And so, I cannot tell you, because if I go on forever, maybe I have to force it too much. If I tell you no, next 1 month is dead.
But maybe I want to go back to Francesco, also what you said, because I remember in a previous conversation
it's
that
also a tool, sorry.
It's
a tool, so like you mentioned it as a toy, and I understand why you refer to it as a toy, but I think it's mostly a tool. So in that sense,
at a certain point you might decide to use other tools.
Exactly.
Well, actually, the reason in that case, it was at the very end. The reason I mentioned the toy was because of something that you have said, and actually I added that from one of your interviews, when you said that actually, yes, which actually had to do with what you're doing right now. And you said that you were thinking of moving in a direction actually of using a lot of images of infancy, and I was very interested in this question of infancy images, also thinking for instance, that it's totally different, but Josko Jones very recently did a show in New York in which suddenly, these infancy images appeared in a whole series of prints, a whole series, and they were very, very, very interesting actually. But now you are producing, of course, in a completely different way. But then you were also saying, I'm planning to use, I want to use, and of course it has to do with your educational project also and the children and all of that. But I had the feeling that you had more of a reach, because to try to think of what kind of tool is a toy. I mean, the tool is something that you make in order to do something. No? You have something that cuts in a certain way, which is suited for cutting wood or for cutting a different kind of material or of a certain shape or of a certain thing. So the tool tends to be unidirectional, tends to have a certain teleology. But actually a toy, it's a very peculiar kind of tool because it actually can be used, yes, it has certain determinations. But then you can't just predict them completely, and it can be used in different ways. You've said yourself that you used, as a child, you used the Star Trek toys in a completely different ways because you were using them in Mexico. And the way Mexican kids were using Star Trek toys was very different from the way actually American kids were using Star Trek toys. So, and you said that polemically when somebody said, what about your Mexican identity? And you said, well, my Mexican identity is Star Trek toys because we use them in a different way. And so this is what I mean, what is this toy tool? I mean, in terms of the direction you're going into now, even things you haven't done yet, but perhaps something you're thinking about, because that's what was seen to be the case.
Like these are puzzles.
Puzzles.
So it comes,
right, I was struck by the puzzles.
They are formed, but of course you can shape them. How you say, like you can remember, you can play with them, turn them around.
That's good.
And what I find interesting is that it takes one of the images and subdivides it. So somehow here we are working, let's say, in the image. So
they
going one more step into the art.
You're deconstructing.
Not so much just contextualizing, but decomposing. It's a mixture of a spider web with a bird.
Right.
It's the pattern.
So there you literally make it a toy.
Yes, so there is a toy. And a lot of thinking, of course, like Montessori toys, which are like educative toys, which are have to be held and touched.
Like free language.
And in that sense, going back to the exhibition, and maybe with a point I've been trying to go back to in what Francesco said as well, because the narrativity, in a sense that, I mean, Meeuwis and Van Deursen say that we have no message, so we use your archive as an abstract thing, like to make semi-conceptual drawings. But in the show, as you will see tomorrow, one of the films, Manimal, which is a digital animation that you made together with your studio, there is a kind of very basic narrative. I was trying to find the word in English, a kind of Urgeschichte, or some kind of very primary kind of story. I mean, you see a pack of wolves moving into the city and actually sort of, in a way, taking it over. And it's very simple, but very threatening, very atmospheric. And in a way, it almost reads like a sort of contemporary fable. I mean, the fable's going from Aesop and La Fontaine till contemporary fables, where the animal represents certain human drives, certain human sins, certain human problems. And it was almost that there you have a very clear kind of message or story.
I had to think it was a bit of a play with my own name, because in most fables at the end you have a moral, and I'm a moral. That's like a moral fable, and that's how I came to the idea to make a fable. Because at the end, it's really not telling you. It doesn't give you a solution.
No,
we were even fantasizing about making the return. So like the next piece should be, okay, now they go from the city back to nature. Could be,
No,
so it becomes like
because it is so, it sort of appeals immediately to also the idea of nature, civilization, the animal going into the city. So it seems like a very kind of basic kind of story.
But also you want to escape.
You know, and since you mentioned Urgeschichte, and we are in Zurich, so we should have stock of archetypes. You know, I mean, we cannot not make it at least a passing reference to Jung's archetype, because actually Jung's archetypes have this multivalence, and you know, and they can be totally ambivalent, right? And not just Jung's archetypes, but you know, archetypes. I mean, like Fenster archetypes. So that's in those terms we can look at at something primary. That because it is primary, it has this multivalence, and it's even inner contradictory balance. And the nature of this inner contradiction is actually relates to the very nature of the symbol, because the symbol is not a sign. The symbol is a symbol because it's two things coming together, and there are usually things that come together because actually they are incompatible. And they can only be held together by the symbol. The symbol is what brings them together and keeps them together, improbably. And so that's the whole other area of things. But talking of things that come together, I don't know if I may say something here. I think there is a whole big area now of your work which we have not mentioned, although you have mentioned Los Ricos and this whole project of the CDs, etc. But I think it's extremely important in your work is music. And you have talked about it, of course, and you know how you're interested in rock and all of that, and all the history, and how that was just important in the factory of Andy Warhol, and how, in a way, that was also a revelation for you, that one could do both and bring them together. But somehow I have the feeling that in your work, it's much more organically, one can say, or disorganically connected than actually ever was in Warhol, you know, in Warhol's factory. For you, music is fundamental. Now, of course, in the history of modernism, you know, music, you know, since Parade, you know, in France, in Paris, then there is, of course, Cage, Rauschenberg, Jones, and Cunningham. But actually, since Cage, Jones, Rauschenberg, and Cunningham, there hasn't been really a collaboration so intense, so close between high art, which yours is high art, I mean, and music, you know, and it's systematically you bring in high art, but not high music, except it's pop music, but it is high music. I mean, I don't know, but I don't care. It's not important. What is important is what is the role of this music. In particular, I'm thinking of the piece that you're all going to see, which is Dark Mirror, where you have actually two images, and I was also going to ask you if this dark mirror refers to the opacity of the mirror, maybe the mirror in third-degree interrogations, where you know they only look through in one direction and not in the other. You cannot see from one side, but you can see from there. But on one side you have the music, and on one side you have the image, and it's the same screen. So that's the dark mirror. So they are mirroring each other, but in a dark way. So what I mean, I just want you to talk.
Also, I showed the pianos in a space there were two pianos together.
Yeah.
And he was playing in one, and the other there was just empty, this piano. And what I did is I filmed the pianos as a reflection on the other piano. And basically, it was because there was too much light. So
You're demystifying it.
Yes, it's okay. And then I thought it's a dark mirror, but of course it reflects, it relates to dark mirrors I have seen before. Like in the Anthropology Museum, they have this obsidian mirror, which is very beautiful, which is the only abstract or really poorly abstract piece that is in the museum, where basically you see yourself. So it's a very magical kind of.
But I think we have been...
It's also like probably this liminal place, or no place.
The utopy.
Between maybe the fantasy and being very rational about how to deal with fantasy. Because I do that. I could have also just go and sit and written 5 very beautiful tales, but I don't have that capacity. I can only reach fantasy through through almost making a whole system in the world. So, which is very contradictory if you think about it, or at least in most or cliche or idea of the. I mean, you don't think of, I don't know, Tolkien, for instance, kind of being very programmatic. I'm sure he was, but it's not really what we continuously see from fantasy.
And then we also, the whole evening we've been also projecting things upon you, like interpretations and it's your own fault you invited us.
I know.
No, but that's nice,
and at the same time,
that's
I think
exactly what I hope the work does.
It does.
That's also why it's interesting that you come with an interpretation, you come with another interpretation.
But you don't feel that, because your work generates a lot of associations and sort of ideas, a lot of a lot of it is verbal and textual, and I feel at the same time your whole work is about the pure power of the image. I mean, if for example, in the piece where the fortune tellers read let's say your personalized tarot cards, it seems very much, it doesn't seem at all a parody on sort of Aberglaube, on superstition, but it seems to talk a lot about like that an image can tell us a lot more about reality than any kind of textual or verbal rendering can, because it contains so many meanings at once.
It's absolutely not a parody. It's not to make fun of it.
No.
It's more because I think there are people who are very used to interpret images. It could also be a psychologist. In that sense, in that piece there is.
But so it doesn't bother you that you actually create a sort of flood of interpretations with something that is basically already so powerful as an image.
No, I think it's interesting.
On the contrary, yeah. That's the sign of success.
Yeah.
Because then is when people start to talk with it or use it.
How many interpretations are there of Las Meninas?
Or like now, because the label, I see a lot of copies for style, let's say. Like people do a lot of flyers for parties. And it's not really that they took my element, but they start to use elements I use. And it's quite funny, and some are horrible, but it's really funny to see that. And it's a black and white thing, and they play, and maybe they put spots.
So the way it's a system that reproduces like rabbits. I mean, it just
But maybe something that is important that it would be good to signal for people who are going to see the show is something that you, Anne, actually called on when we were visiting it today. And you noticed, you were really talking about the materiality of the archive. You were talking about designs and how they were actually made and how in the public here or in any other exhibition of this material may think, well, this is the archive. No, this is not the archive. This is actually objects, a precipitate of the archive. It's like a chemical precipitate. It's actually, the archive is a digital entity. So it's virtual. And it's not, that's the archive. It's not what you're going to see. But you're going to see these objects, which are actually very, very beautiful, which are these precipitates of this virtual thing. And that's very new, and that's very different from anything I think that anybody has done.
And with music, it's a very, I have a very long time friendship with musicians.
Yeah.
And it's, since childhood,
Yes.
Over.
Yeah.
Work.
Yeah.
And what happens is that slowly it has become really part of a shared world.
Yeah.
And I was never able to play guitar, so I had to find another solution. So I said, well, okay, I do the covers.
Yeah.
No, but also I think it has a lot to do with the time we lived in Mexico, which was the 80s, where it was a very, very limited place. It was very culturally very limited, especially for young people.
Yes.
So what we did was basically fantasize a lot about what was going on according to us, because we also got very less information. So let's say we made punks fantastic, we made them like super exotic. And maybe once we saw real punks, they were not that cool. But I think that's something that is interesting, a sense of projecting That's also what interests me of fantasy. That this is a way to project into the world something you basically don't have. So maybe I don't have fantasy at all.
Yeah, my question was going really in this direction, but relating to again to that question of figuration versus abstraction, which is so much there in all the work, and we've seen it in what you showed, and the way these things undo themselves, redo themselves. They are puzzles, but then they are not. They are images that disintegrate. And but then all of this tension, how does it relate to sound? You see, I mean, sound is invisible, right? But you have performance. So that's performance. But the sound itself is invisible. So there is a question of the relationship of invisible sound to performance. And then there is a question of the relation of sound itself and the performance to the image. And to the abstraction and figuration of these images. And it's all very complex, of course. We can't resolve it here, but I'm not just saying. But I put it there because I think it's very interesting. It's a kind of landscape in which you move. And it's something unique. I don't know another artist that moves in this way between these two.
I think the approach, at least in the beginning, was very much more closer to the performance part of sound or music or rock and roll. Because with the work of the wrestlers, what I find out at the end was that more than a performer myself, what I was more almost like a manager or a director. I was more like a facilitator for other professionals. And this is what I thought, okay, with the record label I should do that like in an extreme way. So then we almost became like a gallery in a sense, but for musicians or for performance artists. And then comes the question of the music, which of course I like some more than others. I don't know, in the case of Dark Mirror it was very clear I needed somebody a musician who related to moving images. It was very, very clear. So the guy, maybe, thanks a lot, is silent film, and it's very good. But maybe that was mariachi looking at it. And, but it was not really a choice of the music, but really of the capability of the art of the musician to translate and to relate to that, to give form to that. So I think it's a nice piece, it's a nice piano piece. But let's say it's not like, I'm not really judging in that sense, if it's good or bad. It's more its ability to come to that.
That's interesting.
In the case of Manimal, which is made by Julian, by my friend, we meet almost every day. Yeah, so he really follows my process of working. I constantly show him images, I see what he's doing. So we have a very fluent way to work. And we also speak up, because I'm not a musician, we speak about music in imaginary ways. We say, oh, it looks like yellow, or and that we do the same together. So when I present him an idea, he can visualize it. It works very closely. Maybe that's something we develop from time.
Right. From being so close for a moment.
And to maybe go back to a question that has been asked many times before, which still fascinates me because you keep on insisting that in a way you create a parallel system of forms and images, and people can use them and you use them in a certain way, but most often in sort of co-creativity like you just described. At the same time, there's a certain tone to the images that you use. You feel me coming? In the sense that you can read them as universal and timeless, but there is some kind of dark aura around them. Something that people have been describing in a lot of reviews as morbid, as dark, as like the underbelly. And I know that in interviews you always sort of resist that, because it's another type of projection. But in one of the interviews you do admit, yes, I am interested in sort of the dark side of fantasy, in the dark side of imagination. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah. Maybe I'm a bit of a pessimist. No, I think a lot of the work is erotic. Well, that's one part. That I think most of my work is erotic. It's like to call a label novel ricos, like nouveau rich, and to try to make very successful something that we basically hate was like an erotic move. I also feel that, for instance, to create a horror image with the birds you have in the station, in the train station windows, is ironic. You know, it's because the most stupid kind of image that you get. So in that sense, I think the horror in the work is not so horrible. It's basically, you can also see it in a different way. Like the skull I use, for instance, comes from a toy, from a very silly looking toy. Just that, of course, it's translated and it almost creates a horrible image.
Because it's also a traditional vanitas motive, so people...
Sure. Yeah, on the other hand, I think, I mean, like the major producer of fantasy in the last century was Walt Disney, and it really influenced us, and really created a huge vocabulary.
And there is darkness there too.
And it's very dark, but formally appears as very bright.
Right.
And what I was trying to create was basically the opposite.
The opposite.
I mean, it's one of my frustrated projects, but I would love to work with Walt Disney material, for instance, or to have access to their archive, because you also could decompose, almost in a similar way, their images. Like you could have trees from one side, you can have backgrounds in another side, you can have main characters, and I often wonder what would be to reinterpret it and like recreate other meanings with these images.
Sort of totally deconstructed and then...
Yeah, or I don't know, I think there are different ways you can make a, like I write there, like you can make Bambi again without characters, so it just becomes like landscapes, for instance.
It's almost like Disney through Hitchcock.
Yes.
You filter Disney through, because there is always irony in Hitchcock, there is always this dark comedy. And there is a lot of comedy, there is a lot of...
And I love horror films, and I love horror stories, and I love... So also I use a lot of references. So like there was some installation there with the birds, and of course the first thing you think is Hitchcock. You know? So I often try to make some little references or jokes.
So it's more frivolous than the innocent viewer might think.
Yeah, no, it's things I like.
Speaking of that, you once mentioned Rubens. Somebody said, who's the thinker in painting that you really like? And you said, Paul Rubens.
Oh yeah, David Herman.
Okay. It was not Peter Paul Rubens.
No. That's Pee-wee Herman.
Pee-wee Herman.
You know,
yes. Pee-wee Herman.
They definitely think of him as a thinker, but maybe this is a point also where I don't know that we have to sort
should have
of
some
play it to the
questions
audience.
from the audience, yes. Don't you think?
The thing is becoming a very, like a triologue, and that you might feel that you want to contribute to that.
I would like to invite, if you like to ask or to make a comment of what is said, or if you want to know more from Carlos Amorales, please do it. I will hand you the microphone.
Yes, well, I have a question. At the beginning of the conversation, Mr. Francesco Pellizzi makes some reference with the alchemy and the work. And later it came one comment from Anne Demeester about hybrids from figures. You were using some comments about vectors, archives, and it always came to my mind this reference of cloning. My question is, do you think that part of your work is cloning figures or beats in the computer or this kind of thing?
Yes, sometimes I do, because sometimes I like a poster in the street and I make a picture of it and I basically clone it. And cloning is it's almost like a very graphical term. Like even in Photoshop you have a tool which is called cloning. So basically, let's say to fix an image, you take a little part and you reproduce it. So you create the sameness. What also happens in the archive is that let's say the archive is not only taken from the outside continuously, but images start to refer to themselves.
That's one of the things that I wanted to ask, because cloning is not only copy-paste, but also this this final cloning is not only copy-paste, but the final product has to have a function or something like that.
Carlos, I was thinking with this overwhelming, all these images, and you were kind of like not knowing when she was asking you, will you go on forever with this? So you couldn't say, but I'm sure it will help you probably in the future it's like a filter probably. In a couple of years some images will go down and this little Volvo, some of the Volvo will stay and some not. So probably there's coming out some really strong essence finally, maybe for your work when you're like 65 or 70, or maybe also in 5 years, but it probably helps you to get kind of...
You're using an alchemical method. Are you realizing that? You're describing this process as an alchemical one.
Sure.
I mean, I can only imagine that this is so helpful for you in the future to know what you're really interested in.
I decided to keep every image in the archive because, some I never use again. Some I only use one time and then cannot repeat them. They are too full of meaning. But I decided to keep them because I thought, okay, at least I know why I don't use them again, But it's true, what happens is that I tend to concentrate on certain images. And some images are more and more part of my own, I don't know, like I draw birds forever. And I don't know why I draw birds. I don't have a very specific explanation to do that. But when I was drawing by hand, I did birds and birds and birds and birds. And still now I do them in the archive. And still I use them a lot. So in that sense, there are some kind of fixed images that I think every person has, or every draftsman has, and it's unconscious.
So it becomes sort of your signature.
Well, no, it's like a monothematic thing. It's like
An obsession.
yes, but I don't go and look at this. It's really one thing about drawing in a sense.
But it's funny that if you look at it quantitatively, just in the exhibition, if you look at the collages and the films, it's birds, wolves, skulls, trees that reappear most frequently in a quantitative sense, and they're also the most open, in a way, the most open forms, because they invite, open and abstract at the same time, because everybody has a direct response to them, but you might not have to sort of more specific forms like a crawling person or sort of abstract morphing thing. So it's maybe that you tend towards the universal automatically.
But it's true, through the whole exhibition you see a lot of repetition of the same motifs.
Carlos, in this repetition and simplification of imagery, you refer to them as graphic, which the nature of is to simplify for immediate readability. Where do you see generic and universal? Is it a difference? Is it the same?
Meaning the forms?
The images, your images.
Which one I consider?
Which one, or Do you see a difference between a generic image and a universal image, or are they the same? Is being generic immediately meaning that it's universal?
And this is very much a question of terminology in a sense, like, meaning that I would be very interested to respond to it from a sort of linguistic point of view.
Yeah, that's why I said cardinal.
But that's what, wait.
I don't think the drawings are generic. I think in fact the drawings are very particular, each one of them. Maybe very few of them become generic, like for instance when I directly take a sign from the street, like for instance with this bird, that's a generic bird. The universality of it, I doubt it, because for instance in Europe people are very aware of that bird. But let's say if I bring it to a Mexican audience, this audience will completely not know what is the reference about it. And maybe they think it's a sign for serviette or whatever other thing. Yeah, I think that's how I could split them, maybe. I think that the images are, I don't really see them as universal. Maybe the meaning of them.
No, not the meaning per se, but in paring down the images and simplifying them, is it an attempt to make them universally readable? And does one end up making it generic in the desire to make it universal?
You have to think that these are made to create compositions. So basically what I need to have is the flexibility to be able to combine them. So if I make them too over specific, then I cannot combine them anymore. So that's the way why I simplify them. I will see them more in a pragmatical term. No problem. Why? Why do you ask it?
Well, I haven't seen the exhibition, so it's sort of like, looking at these images that, these are the things that are coming to mind, and then the topics that either have brought up, and this word universality has come up, and accessibility, and, people interpreting, which is a big one in the arts, everybody probably read against interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. So
Let's say
the question came up.
I wish a lot of people could interpret them and use them. But also I think can come to people that they just don't understand them. I think it's also a possibility. Like for instance, the people in the book very much say that. They almost refuse to interpret them. So they just basically find a formula of how to combine the images and create a book. So that was, it goes almost against the nature of what I'm proposing, but still is a possibility to create something to that.
Basically, the simplicity of the form that's a formal thing. So like I reduce it to something that almost looks like a shabon because of formal reasons that you want to combine them in different compositions.
Yeah, so I can continue using them. If you create a drawing with too much identity, you cannot reuse it. I think what I do is basically a graphical process, more than a, it's very graphical. Right?
Two kinds of popular science, popular culture, which is very much reduced. They only play 3 riffs, and they only use. I was very much surprised when you said that the birds you use are partly birds from glass windows, or the skull you use is from a children's toy package,
Sort of.
maybe. And it surprised me quite much because I didn't see it in the exhibition. I only saw it when I went out again, and I saw birds on windows, I thought, isn't it kind of the same? But now I see that you use it in this way, and it made me think of the image that some rock and roll bands, they use wrestling masks. So in fact, they compose two kinds of popular science, popular culture, which is very much reduced. They only play 3 riffs, and they only use a mask of a symbol, of a stereotype. So, in fact, what I see now, I didn't see it before, but you use such a lot of popular icons, which are normally quite loaded with content. You empty it and you recompose it, but you do not use one, but you fill maybe 3 or 4 of such different icons in one picture. So it's totally overloaded with these symbols and things.
It's like a collage.
Do you yourself look at popular culture yourself when you recompose, or do you see other popular culture which is also like reworking, maybe even in an ironic way, such popular icons as werewolves and suns and moons and I don't know, shadows?
Sorry, I didn't really go to the question.
Do you look at the popular culture yourself when you work? Or is it
Yes. Well, yes, because a lot comes from walking in the street, from finding in books, from looking around, basically. So, and a lot of these elements are from popular culture. It's a common design. But not always, because the problem is, for instance, if I would take a comic image, an image from a comic, and use it for a record cover, it might work very well in the record cover. Right? There is one over there. The problem is I cannot reuse it again. It's really, it's so strong in meaning. Like there is, let me look. Like this one. So this originally was a sticker from Bogota, from Colombia. I think maybe from the 80s or something. And it's a really nice image for a record cover. It's like kind of making fun of Playboy and whatever. But the problem is like, I cannot combine it with anything else. If I put an airplane there, see, if I put it in between the trees, if I move the tongue, you know, like there is not much to do about it. So I discovered that there are some symbols or images that are almost untransformable. So in a way, this can come into, it goes back to it goes into the art.
Yeah, over the tongue, say.
It's over the tongue, yeah, it's too much. But like but for instance, the wolf originally came from an encyclopedia of animals. So, but what was nice with that shape is that I could really break it and compose it and mix it and put a skeleton on top of it, and so that's very much kind of how it works. Or also I could just really play with the vectors, you know, like and really deform it. And that's also a form of thing. Some images you can deform and they become other images, and some just stay very untouchable. But yeah. But it's a mixture, it's not only popular images. Those are just two examples. But other are just personal images. Other are images made really on purpose. So it's really a combination of different things.
Nobody else?
I was just wondering before we were talking about the language or characters which are created in this archive, and I was asking myself if there's like a place for them, like the word, or is there a language and where would one speak this language? Like for example, Playboy rabbit over here, he would definitely not be able to live or exist in that world, whereas the wolves and the birds and the planes, they kind of speak the same language. So that's maybe something heading to the direction of what we spoke about before, about this dark humor or horror or whatever. The question would be: is there something like let's say, a place for these characters? Like if you create them and then you bring them out of the archive.
I call them monitos, which is how can I translate?
Little monkeys, yeah.
See, like little monkeys, like Smurfs are. And it's terrible because this art I can never use. Like, it's a folder and I cannot really play a lot with it. But they also have something a bit horrifying, like especially in this one. It looks more like a cocaine rabbit. Very anxious, you know? So I think there it could relate to the horror part of the wolf. Probably it's even more horrible, this one, than the wolf itself.
So another question. Just now came in my mind the name of your figures. In the sense, in your computer, well, most of the artists, or many artists, they choose a nice name for the works, for the paintings. I'm sure that for this maybe it's called Rabbit 121 or something like that.
Rabbit Talk.
Rabbit Talk.
Maybe there's another rabbit, so
and it goes this well.
Yeah, there is a list in the book, and it's really like you see the words that some are in English and some are in Spanish, and then it's a complete mess. But the titles are very pragmatical, and are more for me to
in the computer language, once more.
Yeah.
In the pre-press.
Yeah. Because I use the archive every day, so it's almost like a memory game. I had to experience it when I had to install the archive for the first time. I forgot the CD, so I had to remember it. And then I noticed I could remember it, like I really know it. But it's not because, well, it's basically because I use it every day. So I need to go and make the position. So in that sense, I also need to call them in a very simple way or very recognizable way.
I have a very simple question. Is there a difference when you show your work in Europe or in South America? Because you taught a lot of rock music, punk music, and all your symbols comes from there, and now it's such a clean exhibition. And I saw more exhibitions, I think, in Europe were so clean, and for me it's a little bit difficult to see this, where it comes from and then how it looks like. And when I see the pictures from the streets and from your work with Nuevos Ricos, and when I see the homepage, there's a different sense. Is there a difference?
Well, I'm normally very clean with my work. I don't know, I don't know why. But I tend to be very clean with the work. Of course, if you see something that happened in the street in Zurich, looks very different than as it has happened in Mexico. Like, totally different.
You adopt the sterile aesthetics of the environment.
Sorry?
You adapt to the sterile aesthetics of the environment.
Well, you cannot change it, you know. It's not like, okay, I'm going to put a poster on the street, please clean the street, and then we put the poster. If you're in Mexico, you know, like, it's really how it is. But I don't know, maybe it's also because I work a lot with widescreens, because I use a lot this Illustrator program, which the background is white. So I tend to see my work a lot always against white. So, and also it's like the screen is kind of endless. It has no real horizon. It's not flat in your face. So I also tend to compose my exhibitions very much in that way. Like, I don't know. It happens like this. It's more the rock concerts what becomes there.
So you were saying at the beginning that they are vectors and they're just like numbers and they doesn't exist actually because they are in the computer.
Sort of. I mean, that's more a thought because I'm not a computer programmer, so it's not like I go like. And
so
then image forms.
when did you have the feeling that they had to have a name? So they have to come out and have a personality.
Again, to remember them, to be able to remember them.
And was it with tarot? Well, with the tarot people, the people who read the cards.
What?
The first time that they came out of the computer, these symbols.
No.
Or through friends.
Sorry?
Through friends.
Through friends?
Yeah, through your friends that they start to interpretate them.
No, indeed. The tarot was like the first real project to really bring it inside.
So you had the feeling that they had to be interpreted.
I was curious because when I do them, I don't know what they mean.
Mm-hmm.
And of course I can call one fury, another disgrace, another wrong, or you know, I can kind of force an interpretation into them. But honestly, I don't understand what they mean. I don't see that. So for me, it's more like a visual composition. So what I was interested was to see what other people could, you know, like potentially give them a name.
That other people tell your story.
In a sense, but it's not my story because I don't depart really with the story. I've just provoked the possibility for a story. On the other hand, what was interesting is that nobody was agreeing with each other. So one will call the spider web this, the other that, the other that. So, you know, like, but maybe it's the same that happened with tarot eventually. You know, like maybe when somebody invented tarot, it was so open that nobody really knew what was about. But through the usage of it in the centuries, like certain symbols start to formalize. So everybody agrees that that is that to say, you know. And then like tarot is not free, in fact, it's really a system of language. And when I just put something like this to them, of course they don't even know how to react. You know? So like some were very close and really rejected the project and say like, it's horrible or it's hell, or some took it very light, or some basically told me, I mean, I could have put a tarot card or this card or whatever card, and they would have said the same. You know, like almost cynically, like just wanting money or something. And then there were people who really tried to go into it like, very deeply. In particular, there was a woman which was very interesting she was developing a tarot for blind people. So almost like a braille tarot. Mm-hmm. And she had to think in all different, because it was not of points, because it's really not about language or like spoken language, but it's about visual language. So she found a certain strange geometrical system to propose them. And it was interesting because she was somebody who had been really thinking deeply about the meaning of it. It was like an abstract tarot. And that's why, I mean, I call them tarot in a way like these cards, but they are not tarot. They are adivinatory cards. Because if I would call them tarot, it's like if it's like Dali doing a tarot, you know. But then they will be completely wrong.
Again, it's the question of abstraction comes up. There is a quote from you. That's why I'm not interfering with the question just because it's from Carlos. And he says, "My forms are graphic, not realistic. Therefore, they are suggestive. At least I wish for that. In the future, I would love to be able to create a horror vocabulary that is purely abstract." These are your words.
Yes. I would like to, because of course I get tired of all these wolves and liars. So it would be very nice eventually to come closer to that.
And sort of optimize the ambiguity, because I have the impression that it's something that's extremely important for you is open-endedness and ambiguity.
Yes, yes. In their interview with Hansen, I speak a bit about a piece in the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico, sort of anthropology in Mexico, which is called Cuatlicue, which is like two snakes looking at each other in profile. But because the eyes are, you know, because they form this symmetrical, you can also see them as a frontal face. But what I find very interesting is that they come towards you. As the, well, towards me, not towards the viewer, as in the opposite of how we do faces, which are round. So it creates a very strange ambiguity, this piece. So you almost feel it's alive, because there is something which, in a way, is so monumental. It's a stone, it's almost 3 meters high, and something is not resolved. Something vibrates. And, I mean, it was made on purpose like this. And this is what makes it so powerful. And I often hope I could do these sort of images which you cannot really solve. You're gonna say, okay, this is whatever, I don't know.
Not the...
No, like, okay, this is about the war in Iraq, fine. Or, you know, it's really like you feel you understand, but at the end you don't manage to really understand. But especially it's not only something I think towards the viewer, it's something I think towards myself.
Yeah.
That's how I want to experience my drawings.
It's interesting you mentioned the Cuatlicue, because actually those images, the Cuatlicue and the one they just found, the new one, they were actually made to be totally ambivalent. I mean, they didn't relate to the living, but they related actually to the earth. So they were actually looking both ways. They were images that were dual, inherently dual. That's
I think even Cuatlicue was not displayed publicly, it was really hidden.
right.
So actually the viewer, we don't know who was the viewer.
Remained veiled. Maybe that's where we should round it up before we completely unveil and unmask.
Our boss here.
We have to unveil the whole thing. I have three, maybe not last questions, I have three questions all concerning language. The first one is, I see your signs you use, which comes from sometimes from the World Wide Web, from the web, which also is something like a sign or even an image for globalization. And it's even a well-known background of the signs from the Gothic and punk and rock signs, like Michael also told me a little bit about these things. Even though we have these global and well-known signs and culture, do you see any difference in the use of the signs in the South American, specifically in the Mexican culture and in the European culture, as you know both cultures? I mean, the specific use and gives the meaning of these signs.
Yes, I think we tend to be more narrative. Like when you see Mexican muralism, you see much more of I say, like you read the picture. It's like you really go from one side to the other side, seeing, for instance, the history of humanity. You know? So you see a Karl Marx, you see a Mao, you see and a lot of, at least the Mexican art is much more, in that sense, visual narrative, almost like comics. While I think in Europe, for instance, it's much more reduced, it works in a different way. And in American art, it's almost simplified to one. clear image. I think we tend to do it differently in that sense. I mean, it's like, for instance, it's very few images I took from internet, and especially because I don't want to make internet such an interesting place. And basically the airplanes which I took from internet.
Another question goes to the materialization of your images. As you do it, or you work with the computer, with the digital world, you could say, in my opinion, there would be no meaning or no sense to materialize the whole thing. And if you do it, there has to be a decision how you do it. Is it going to be a sculpture? Is it going to be architecture? Is it going to be painting, a drawing, or something like a so-called Scherenschnitt in German, means the silhouettes? How do you make these decisions? Because the design, or the science, I have to say, the science could work in every materialization. Why do you do a painting? Why do you do a drawing? How do you come to it? You can just do it in a computer maybe, so as projection.
I don't like the computer too much. As I don't like internet. I don't like computer.
You use it
No,
as
but
an instrument.
yeah, to me it's an instrument. I find it horrible to like spend 8 hours a day watching at the screen and then invite everybody to watch at my screen. I find it really very limiting. Also, let's say I cannot open 1,000 images at the same time, for instance, because all will become this big in the computer screen. So it's through materialization that you can see the totality sometimes. You know, the computer still is a very frontal tool. So, and on the other hand, I also think there are qualities in real life, or let's say outside of the computer, which to me at least are still very important. Maybe the quality of colors, the quality of materials, how certain materials feel in relation to other materials. I feel if the archive would have been made, for instance, in acrylic, it would have given a completely different feeling as it's now made on black paper. So all this, I think, is important to take into account.
Yes, I understand that. I read your work as a, let's say, an iconic language, and even without thinking about the materiality behind. Of course, I think it's very important if a work is written, if it's spoken, if it's sang, and all these things. It makes another, you use it in another way, and it means another thing. Words sung by in an opera of Verdi is something else than you read in a philosophical text. So if a signature or a sign you use, it's absolutely different if it's as a painting on a canvas on the wall or as a spray work in the street. It's not only the context, it's also the materialization. That's why, do you have a surprise there in this, how to say, making a decision? Is there a surprise for you which gives you something more than it was before in the computer?
Yes, yes.
Could you describe this? I mean, the surprise in the materialization.
Either I don't like it or I like it. I mean, it's a feeling. It's really it's like the way you like something. You know, like some things are beautiful, and some things you don't find that beautiful. And to me, I find it more beautiful maybe sometimes if I materialize it. Something like that.
That's the last question. Working with the computer, a lot of things is really predictable. You can see what you do, and this is the result because you know the program and all these things. And you use the computer a lot. And you use it as an instrument, not for presentation, obviously. Do you have, by working with the computer and with these programs, is there also something like a surprise in your artistic decisions? Or do you know exactly always what's coming out and you use it very strategically?
No, I hope it's always, I try to make it a surprise, because if I don't make it a surprise for myself, I will be super bored.
But this surprise comes from the specific, from the tool or from the instrument of the computer?
You know, I work with computers, but I'm not a computer freak. But I work with a computer freak, so I let the computer freak do the freaking part. He surprised me a lot. I'm often marveled by what he's showing me. And he's German, on top of it, so he's very, very serious. You know, like, it's also not, it has nothing to do with in Mexico how people take it, or here. I think now we are almost in an equal possibilities to understand each other. I would say 10 years ago was almost impossible to understand each other. I think now it's almost very possible to understand each other. Culture, people, you know. But also, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people here who draw with the same exactly program I'm using. And there's nothing mystic about it. It's Adobe Illustrator. You know, and it's a very simple thing. And basically, rotoscoping is something a lot of designers do, and use it a lot. So in that sense, we all share a same language. Well, we can discuss about that language or not. Or in the same sense, I think it's important to find different ways to exteriorize that, because it seems to me that in computers we tend to sameness, because basically, you know, like, I'm not surprised to see this Appel here. It could be in my studio, it could be in the Mexican university. So basically, the possibilities are almost the same for you as for me. But if I decide to create this into wood and paint it by hand, or let somebody else paint it, or use a color wood, or etc., I can bring this image, and I can bring the experience of this image to you in a different form, in a form that maybe is not so close to you, and that might surprise you or might give you other thoughts.
I have something to relate to this marvel question that he has raised. And since we are talking about computers, and since we are in Zurich and we are in this middle Europe, heart of Europe, where the whole idea of the Wunderkammer was born, and our collections of objects, our archives of oddities and marvels. Do you see the computer as a Wunderkammer of sort? And, you know, why did you call a piece of yours Useless Wonder? Useless Wonder. I was very struck by this title, you know, the question of what is the aim? You know, a wonder without aim, right? And so why? It's interesting.
I think it can be you know, it's like now people use it as an entertainment center, as a communication center, as a working center, as a display center, and you know, like it's overtaking a lot. And me personally, I try not to do that, because I feel I'm missing life, or I'm missing other things, and also because I think one tends to realize that, okay, the internet is everything. It actually is nothing. It's a very, very, very small percentage of the human knowledge is in the internet. And even basic things you research in them, and they're just simply not there. And maybe because they existed before the 80s, or it's maybe a time thing. So I try to not, I think it's important not to be so much fetishizing.